In a small southern town, Officer Mark Trennan makes a mistake that could cost him everything. A moment of judgment leads him to publicly humiliate Sam Evans, a quiet, elderly black man, who turns out to be a respected war veteran with deep roots in the community. Mark's actions ignite a wave of outrage and force him into a painful reckoning with his own beliefs and choices. As his world unravels, he finds himself drawn into an unexpected journey, guided by the very man he wronged. Through humility, service, and the steady hand of a mentor, Mark begins to see the world through new eyes. But can he truly repair the trust he's broken? Will he find the strength to become the man his community needs, or is his redemption out of reach? If you're ready to follow Mark's journey through mistakes, forgiveness, and self-discovery, hit subscribe and leave a comment below. Let us know what you think of the story so far and what moments stood out to you. Grab a seat, and let's begin. The sun blazed mercilessly over Ashton Heights, its rays bouncing off the old brick buildings and empty sidewalks. The heat was thick, almost tangible, wrapping around Officer Mark Trennan like a shroud as he leaned against his patrol car, squinting into the distance. Summer in Ashton always brought out the crowds, kids splashing in pools, families walking the shaded park paths. But it also brought tension, a kind of unrest simmering just below the surface. Mark pulled off his cap, running a hand through his hair before wiping the sweat from his brow. He glanced across the street toward the community pool, where the sounds of children laughing and splashing filled the air. Behind them, their parents lounged in the shade, chatting idly and sipping from water bottles. It was the kind of day where everything seemed lazy, drawn out, slow, and yet, Mark couldn't shake a strange tension lingering in his mind. His gaze shifted, and that's when he noticed him. An older black man sat alone at the edge of the pool, a worn cap pulled low over his brow and his hands resting on his knees. The man's presence struck Mark as out of place. This wasn't the usual crowd of families or teenagers who frequented the pool, and Mark couldn't recall seeing him around before. The man's posture was calm, unassuming, yet something about his solitary figure rubbed Mark the wrong way. Mark's hand instinctively went to his belt, fingers brushing against his radio. "Guess I'd better check it out," he muttered to himself, pushing away from the car and making his way toward the fence that enclosed the pool. His movements were brisk, businesslike, and as he neared the man, a slight sense of purpose settled over him, the kind that came from enforcing order, maintaining control. To Mark, order was everything. It was what kept this town running, what kept people safe. As he approached, the man turned slightly, his gaze lifting to meet Mark's. His eyes were hidden behind thick-rimmed glasses, but the tilt of his head suggested curiosity, as though he were surprised, maybe even mildly amused, by the sight of an officer coming his way. "Afternoon," Mark greeted him, his tone polite but firm, one he had mastered over years of dealing with the public. The man gave a nod, a quiet, almost imperceptible acknowledgement. "Afternoon," he replied, his voice deep and steady, carrying a note of warmth. "Hot day," Mark remarked, waiting, hoping the man might offer some explanation for why he was here. The man shrugged, a small, almost careless gesture. "Sure is." Mark shifted, folding his arms across his chest, his expression hardening. "Mind if I ask what you're doing here?" For a moment, the man didn't respond, his gaze drifting back to the pool. Finally, he spoke, his tone calm and unwavering. "Just an officer, enjoying the day." Mark felt a flicker of irritation, a man of this age, sitting by the pool alone on a day meant for families and kids. It didn't feel right. "You live around here?" he asked, his tone sharpening. The man turned to him again, his mouth curving into a slight smile, one that seemed to hold a hint of pity. "Longer than you have, I imagine." Mark's jaw tightened, his fingers flexing at his sides. There was something about this man's demeanor that made him uncomfortable, as if he were being challenged without a word. The silence between them grew tense, and for a moment, Mark found himself at a loss. His usual tactics, his authoritative presence, his calm yet commanding tone seemed to slide off this man like water. "Look," Mark said, his voice taking on a harder edge, "this is a community pool, meant for residents, families mostly. If you're not here with anyone, It might be best for you to move along." The man let out a quiet breath, more like a sigh than anything else. "Is that so?" he replied, his tone laced with a patience that made Mark bristle. "Yes, it is," Mark retorted, his voice low. "We don't want any trouble here." "Trouble?" The man's eyebrows lifted slightly, a glimmer of amusement in his expression. "Son, I'm just sitting here. Seems to me the only trouble is what you brought with you." At that, a few people glanced over, sensing the tension in Mark's stance in his words. Mark's irritation flared, mingling with a strange sense of helplessness he didn't recognize. Authority was slipping from his grasp, and the more he struggled to hold it, the more elusive it felt. "You know what?" Mark said, his voice sharper, louder now. "I think you've overstayed your welcome." And before he could think twice, he reached out, nudging the man's shoulder, a gesture meant to be firm, authoritative. But in his agitation, his movement was stronger than he intended. The man teetered, his balance wavering as he stumbled back, his arms flailing for a split second before he tumbled backward into the pool. There was a splash, a collective gasp from the crowd, and Mark's heart seized as he watched the man flounder, struggling to find his footing in the water. The depth was shallow, but the shock was evident on his face, his features contorted in a mix of surprise and something Mark couldn't quite place, disappointment. A young woman near the poolside whipped out her phone, her expression one of horror. "You can't do that," she cried, her voice sharp and furious. "You can't just shove him like that." Mark felt a cold, sinking sensation in his stomach. People were staring, phones raised, recording, their expressions a mix of anger and disbelief. The old man, soaking wet, dragged himself to his feet, his gaze fixing on Mark with a look that cut deeper than any words could. Mark swallowed hard, his mind reeling. He'd acted on instinct, on impulse, but now, under the eyes of the crowd, he felt exposed, vulnerable in a way he hadn't anticipated. The man climbed out of the pool, water streaming down his clothes, and for a moment, the two men stood there, locked in a silent standoff. But there was no anger in the man's gaze, only a quiet, unyielding sadness, as though he were looking at a man who had lost his way. Without a word, the man turned, his wet clothes clinging to him as he walked away, his dignity somehow intact despite the humiliation. And as Mark watched him go, he felt a chill settle over him, a sense of dread creeping into his bones. He hadn't just pushed a man into a pool. He'd crossed a line, and deep down, he knew there was no going back. The next morning, Mark woke with a sense of unease. The events of the previous day played on a loop in his mind, each detail sharper, more condemning than the last. He could still see the look on the man's face, the silent rebuke that had settled in his gaze. It was a look Mark couldn't shake, one that gnawed at him in the early hours as he stared up at the ceiling, unable to sleep. A notification buzzed on his phone, and he reached for it, already dreading what he might see. The video had gone viral, spreading across social media like wildfire. The caption was simple but damning. "Officer pushes elderly man in a pool for no reason." The footage was grainy, but the details were unmistakable. Mark's face set in irritation, his hand reaching out to shove the man, the splash, the gasp from the crowd, all of it preserved, unfiltered, unflinching. He scrolled through the comments, each one harsher than the last. "This is disgusting. That man served our country, and this is how he's treated? This officer needs to be held accountable. Enough is enough." Mark's stomach twisted as he read on, the words blurring together in a torrent of anger and condemnation. He thought he was just doing his job, just enforcing order, but now, as he watched the video through the eyes of the public, he saw something different, an abuse of power, a man lashing out, blind to the dignity of the person before him. The phone slipped from his hands, clattering onto the floor, and he buried his face in his hands, his mind reeling with a sickening realization. He had made a mistake, a terrible, irrevocable mistake, and he knew, in that moment, that there would be consequences. At the station later that day, Mark felt the weight of every gaze, the silent judgment in each passing glance. Conversations hushed as he walked by, heads turning, eyes averted. He felt like a stranger, an outcast in a place that had once been his refuge. His supervisor, Sergeant Tom Cassidy, called him into his office, his expression grim. "Mark," he began, his tone weary, as if the words pained him. "I don't know what you were thinking. I don't know how you thought this would end, but this is bad. Real bad." Mark opened his mouth to explain, to offer some kind of defense, but the words caught in his throat. For the first time, he had none. Cassidy leaned forward, his gaze hard. "Do you know who that man was?" "Samuel Evans. He's a retired Navy veteran. A man who served his country, who has lived in this town longer than you and I combined. And you shoved him. You humiliated him, publicly." Mark swallowed, the words settling over him like a weight. Samuel Evans, a man with a history, a life, someone he had dismissed in a heartbeat, without a second thought. Shame burned in his chest, and he lowered his gaze, unable to meet Cassidy's eyes. "You're suspended, effective immediately," Cassidy continued, his voice unyielding. "And I suggest you take this time to think long and hard about what you've done." Mark nodded, the shame and regret pressing down on him, suffocating. He rose to his feet, leaving Cassidy's office in silence, the reality of his actions sinking in with every step. As he walked out of the station, the whispers followed him, a chorus of disapproval that echoed in his mind. He knew, in that moment, that his life, his career, everything he had once held secure, was unraveling. And it was all his doing. Days passed in a blur of regret and uncertainty. Mark barely left his house, avoiding the judgmental stares of his neighbors, the whispers that followed him everywhere. He knew his suspension wasn't just a pause, it was a reckoning. Every idle moment seemed filled with the images he couldn't shake. The quiet authority in Sam's eyes, the stunned silence of the crowd, the feeling of shame that settled deeper with each passing day. Late one evening, unable to sleep, Mark sat in his dim living room, the glow of his phone screen illuminating his face. The video of the pool incident had taken on a life of its own, shared and reshared with every angle dissected, every detail criticized. And now more stories about Sam were emerging. Photos of him in uniform, images of his younger self standing tall and proud, letters from those who remembered his kindness and courage, all shared by friends, family, and neighbors who had known and respected him for years. One post in particular caught Mark's eye, a black and white photograph of Sam, much younger, in his Navy uniform, standing with a quiet pride that resonated even through the screen. Below the photo was a caption from Sam's son, David Evans. "My father has served his country, his family, and this town with honor and dignity his entire life. He deserved better than this. We all deserve better than this." Mark stared at the words, his heart pounding, his throat tight. He hadn't known Sam's history, hadn't known what the man had sacrificed, what he'd endured, or what he'd given back to his community. He'd seen only what he expected to see, an old man alone by a pool, someone who didn't belong. The weight of his ignorance settled over him like a dark cloud. It was then, in the quiet hours of the night, that Mark felt something break open within him, a raw, unyielding need to make amends, though he had no idea where to start. The next morning, Mark found himself driving to the Veterans Center on the outskirts of town. He had no plan, no clear sense of what he would say or do. But he couldn't ignore the pull that brought him here, a quiet urgency urging him to confront the damage he'd done. As he walked into the modest building, he was met with silence. A few men glanced up from where they sat, their faces a mixture of surprise and suspicion. Mark felt their gazes linger, felt the weight of their scrutiny as he approached the front desk. I'm looking for Sam Evans," he said, his voice hesitant. The receptionist, an older woman with sharp eyes, looked at him for a long moment. "He's in the back," she said finally, nodding toward a door down the hall. "But he might not be too happy to see you." Mark nodded, accepting the warning. He made his way down the narrow corridor, each step feeling heavier than the last. When he reached the small rec room at the end, he saw Sam sitting by a window, his hands resting on his lap, his gaze fixed on the trees outside. Mark cleared his throat, feeling a surge of nerves. "Mr. Evans?" he said softly, stepping into the room. Sam turned slowly, his expression unreadable. He didn't say anything, didn't move, just watched as Mark approached. Mark hesitated, feeling the weight of the moment, the gravity of the hurt he had caused. I came to apologize, he began, his voice barely a whisper. For what I did, for how I treated you. Sam regarded him in silence, his gaze unwavering. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, but there was a hardness there, a depth of disappointment that struck Mark to his core. You pushed me into that pool like I was nothing, he said quietly. Like I didn't belong there. Why? Mark felt his throat tighten, the words catching as he tried to explain. I thought you were... I don't know what I thought. I was wrong. I was so wrong. Sam shook his head, his expression sad. You didn't see me, officer. You saw what you wanted to see, what you expected to see. But that's not who I am. And that's not who anyone is. Mark felt a surge of shame, his head bowing as Sam's words sank in. He wanted to explain, to offer excuses, but he knew they would be hollow. Instead, he stood in silence, letting the weight of his mistakes settle over him. Apologies are fine, Sam continued, his gaze still fixed on Mark. But if you really want to make amends, then you need to change how you see people, how you judge them. Start with yourself, and maybe one day you'll understand what it means to truly serve. Mark nodded, his voice barely a whisper. I will, sir. I promise. Sam held his gaze for a moment longer, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a start. Over the following weeks, Mark's world became smaller, quieter. His suspension lingered, and without the structure of work, he found himself adrift, unsure of where he belonged. Days blurred together, a monotonous cycle of regret and self-reflection. But amid the stillness, he began to confront parts of himself. He had long ignored the rigid beliefs, the judgments, the ingrained biases that had once felt like truth. One morning, restless and uneasy, he drove to the community center where a group of veterans had gathered for a meeting. He recognized a few faces, men he had once dismissed as irrelevant, their stories unknown and unimportant to him. Now, he approached them cautiously, humbly, unsure of how he would be received. To his surprise, they didn't turn him away. Some offered nods of acknowledgement. Others met him with wary glances. One man, a gruff former Marine named Frank, gave him a long, assessing look before clapping him on the shoulder. Heard you've been stopping by the center lately, Frank said, his tone gruff but not unkind. Guess you're finally ready to listen, huh? Mark nodded, grateful for the small opening. Yeah, I am. As the veterans shared stories of their service, their struggles, and their sacrifices, Mark listened with a new sense of humility. He realized how much he had overlooked, how little he had understood about the people he was supposed to serve. These men had faced hardships he could barely comprehend, yet they carried themselves with a quiet dignity that humbled him. It was during one of these gatherings that he learned more about Sam's history, his service in the Navy, his years advocating for civil rights, his tireless work in the community. Each story added another layer to the man he had once dismissed, each detail deepening Mark's sense of regret and determination to make things right. After weeks of volunteering, Mark received an unexpected invitation. The town council had organized a public meeting to discuss recent tensions, and he was asked to attend. He knew it would be a difficult evening, that he would have to face the community he had wronged, but he also knew he couldn't shy away from the consequences of his actions. The meeting was held in the town's old community hall, a modest building with creaky wooden floors and rows of folding chairs. The air was thick with tension as residents filled the room, their faces a mix of anger, disappointment, and curiosity. Mark took a seat in the back, his heart pounding as he waited for the meeting to begin. The first speakers were community members, each one sharing stories of frustration, moments when they felt unseen or misunderstood by law enforcement. Some spoke of their own experiences, others of the incident with Sam, their voices carrying a note of hurt that struck Mark deeply. Finally, after what felt like hours, it was Mark's turn to speak. He rose slowly, making his way to the front of the room, every step heavy with the weight of his past mistakes. When he reached the podium, he took a deep breath, his gaze sweeping over the faces of his neighbors, his friends, his critics. I know I've let you down, he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. I know I made a terrible mistake. I judged a man I didn't know, a man who deserved my respect, and in doing so, I hurt this community. I wish I could take it back, but I know I can't. All I can do now is try to make things right. He paused, his throat tight as he searched for the right words. Since that day, I've been trying to understand the harm I caused, to listen, to learn. I want to earn back your trust, not just with words, but with actions. I know it won't be easy, and I know it will take time. But I'm here, and I'm willing to do the work. The room was silent as he finished, the weight of his apology settling over the crowd. He could see skepticism in some eyes, anger in others, but he also saw a glimmer of understanding, a small, tentative opening that gave him hope. And as he returned to his seat, he felt a sense of resolve, a commitment to the journey ahead. This was only the beginning, but it was a step forward, a step toward the redemption he knew he had to earn. Mark spent the next few days volunteering more regularly at the Veterans Center, joining events, helping with chores, and quietly learning from those around him. Each day brought a new story, a new layer to the lives of people he had once overlooked. He began to see a pattern in their resilience, a steady, calm strength that had endured hardship and prejudice with grace. And slowly, through these interactions, he felt his own perspective shift, his sense of authority tempered by the humility these men exemplified. One evening, Mark was folding chairs after a community event when Sam approached him, his expression thoughtful. "Mark," Sam said, his voice steady but warm, "I've been watching you here. You're doing good work, listening, learning, but there's something else you need to do." Mark looked up, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Sam paused, as if weighing his words. "You need to show this town that your heart's really changed, not just here at the center, but out there where it matters. I want you to attend the next youth workshop at the high school. We're starting a mentorship program with a few officers and some of the young folks in town. Think you're up for it?" The request caught Mark off guard. The idea of working with teens, many of whom had likely seen the viral video of his mistake, was intimidating. But he knew Sam was right. He couldn't hide behind the comfort of the Veterans Center forever. Real change, he realized, meant stepping into places where his past might be questioned, where his commitment to growth would be tested. He nodded slowly, his resolve settling. "I'll be there." Sam's eyes softened, a glimmer of approval in his gaze. "Good. That's a start." The following week, Mark arrived at Ashton High School, where a small group of teenagers had gathered in the gymnasium for the mentorship program. The kids ranged in age from 15 to 18, a mix of young men and women, some eyeing him warily, others watching him with open curiosity. Mark's stomach churned with nerves. He knew he had to earn their trust, and that it wouldn't come easy. The school counselor, Ms. Ramirez, introduced the officers and gave a brief speech about the importance of building community connections. When it was Mark's turn to speak, he felt every gaze fixed on him, felt the weight of their expectations and skepticism pressing down on him. "Hi, everyone," he began, his voice steady but quiet. "I'm Officer Trenton, but you can call me Mark." He paused, taking in their expressions, noting the mistrust in some eyes. "I know some of you may have seen me around, and maybe you've heard about what happened a few months back. I made a serious mistake, one that hurt someone who deserved my respect." He took a breath, letting the weight of his admission sink in. "I'm here now because I want to make things right, to learn from people like you, and to be a better officer and a better person. I know that change doesn't happen overnight, but I'm committed to earning back the trust that I lost. I hope you'll give me a chance to do that." A silence settled over the group, broken only by the occasional shuffle of feet or whisper. Some of the kids exchanged looks, a few even offering slight nods. But most simply watched, their expressions guarded. One student, a tall, lean young man named Luis, raised his hand. "Officer Trenton," he said, his tone cautious but respectful, "how do we know this isn't just for show? I mean, how do we know you're really serious about this?" The question was fair, and Mark appreciated the honesty. He met Luis's gaze, feeling the full weight of his scrutiny. "I don't expect you to believe me right away, Luis. All I can do is show up every day and prove it to you through my actions. You have my word on that." Luis nodded, seeming to accept the answer, though his expression remained thoughtful. Mark felt a flicker of relief. It wasn't acceptance, but it was a beginning. Over the next several weeks, Mark committed himself to the mentorship program, joining the students in activities, listening to their stories, and sharing his own experiences. He worked alongside them in community service projects, helped them with school assignments, and gradually earned the trust of a few. Luis, who had been one of his most vocal skeptics, began to open up, sharing stories of his own struggles. Mark learned that Luis had dreams of joining the military, but was often discouraged by people who doubted his ability to succeed. Mark, understanding what it felt like to be underestimated, became one of Luis's strongest supporters, encouraging him to pursue his goals and offering advice on how to prepare for the challenges ahead. One afternoon, as they cleaned up the local park together, Luis asked, "So, what made you want to change?" The question, simple yet profound, struck Mark deeply. He thought for a moment before answering. "I realized that I'd been living my life by a set of rules that didn't serve anyone but myself. I thought authority meant control, that respect was something I could demand. But I was wrong. Real respect, real honor is something you earn by showing up, by doing the work, even when it's hard." Luis nodded, seeming to absorb the answer. "Guess it takes a lot to admit that." "It does," Mark replied, a small smile touching his lips. "But it's worth it." As word of Mark's involvement in the community spread, a cautious optimism began to take root. He still faced skepticism and occasional criticism, but there were also moments of kindness, gestures that reminded him of the importance of his work. Neighbors who had once ignored him began to nod in acknowledgement. Parents would wave as he passed, and some even stopped to thank him for his efforts. One evening, after a particularly long day, Mark found a note taped to his front door. It was handwritten, the script neat and precise, and when he unfolded it, he recognized Sam's name at the bottom. The note was brief, but its message carried weight. "Mark, keep going. Real change takes time, but the work you're doing matters. Don't let up." The words settled over him like a balm, a reminder that even in his lowest moments, he had people who believed in his capacity to grow. He carefully folded the note, tucking it into his wallet where it would remain, a quiet symbol of his commitment to the journey ahead. A few weeks later, the town held a public forum to address concerns about policing and community relations. The meeting was set up in the town's community center, with rows of chairs lined up facing a panel where Mark and several other officers sat, prepared to listen and answer questions. The hall was filled to capacity, residents eager to share their thoughts, their voices a blend of hope and frustration. One by one, community members stood, sharing their grievances, their fears, their hopes for a more inclusive, respectful relationship with law enforcement. Mark listened intently, taking notes, offering assurances when he could. He knew that words alone weren't enough, but he wanted the people in that room to know that he was committed to hearing them, to understanding their experiences. Toward the end of the forum, a young mother stood up, holding her daughter's hand. She looked directly at Mark, her expression wary yet open. "Officer Trenton," she began, "I've seen you working with the kids, with my own son, in fact. And I just want to say, it means something to us. Seeing you there, trying, it gives us hope." The words, simple yet heartfelt, filled Mark with a sense of gratitude he hadn't felt in years. He met her gaze, offering a small nod. "Thank you. That means a lot." The culmination of Mark's journey came one warm autumn evening, when the Veterans Center invited him to co-host a community event honoring Sam and other veterans for their service. The event, held in the town square, was a celebration of resilience, unity, and the contributions of those who had served with honor and dignity. As Mark stood beside Sam on the small stage, he felt a profound sense of connection to the town, a shared purpose that transcended the mistakes of his past. He spoke to the crowd, his voice steady as he expressed his gratitude to Sam and to the community for the chance to make amends, for the opportunity to grow and learn from his mistakes. When Sam took the microphone, he addressed the crowd with quiet strength, his words a reminder of the values he held dear. This town has seen its share of hardship, its share of mistakes. But what matters most is how we choose to move forward. We can't undo the past, but we can shape the future. And it's up to each of us to do our part. As the evening drew to a close, Mark felt a sense of peace settle over him. He knew his journey was far from over, that he would continue to face challenges and doubts. But he also knew that he had earned a place in the hearts of those he served, a place built not on authority, but on trust, on understanding, on a willingness to listen. For the first time, he understood the true meaning of respect, not as something to be taken, but as something to be given, something that grew from humility and compassion, something that endured. And as he stood beside Sam, looking out over the crowd, he felt a quiet, steady conviction that he would carry this lesson with him for the rest of his life. Autumn swept through Ashton Heights in a wave of amber leaves and brisk winds, transforming the town into a patchwork of red, yellow, and gold. Mark Trennan found himself wandering the streets on his day off, pausing now and then to chat with neighbors he hadn't spoken to in years. Some offered polite nods, others a quick hello, and a few, perhaps surprisingly, even struck up conversations. His past hung over him like a shadow, yet he sensed a growing acceptance, a sense that maybe, just maybe, he was beginning to be seen as something more than the man who'd made that terrible mistake. Later that evening, he returned home to find a letter waiting in his mailbox. It was from the town council, and as he opened it, he felt a nervous thrill mixed with apprehension. The council had formally invited him to join the new Community Relations Task Force, a role that would allow him to continue working directly with residents, bridging the gap between law enforcement and the community. The invitation felt like a lifeline. Mark's heart pounded with a sense of responsibility, realizing that this wasn't just about his personal redemption anymore. It was a chance to bring about real, lasting change. It was an opportunity to help reshape the community's relationship with its police force, to make it one of trust and mutual respect. But as excited as he was, Mark knew he couldn't accept without first talking to Sam. Over the past months, Sam had become more than a mentor. He was the quiet, guiding presence in Mark's life, the one who'd seen through the facade of his authority and shown him the value of humility. That night, Mark called Sam, arranging to meet the next day at the community center. The following afternoon, Mark arrived at the community center just as Sam was finishing up a meeting with a group of veterans. Sam looked up as Mark entered, a faint smile on his face, as if he knew what Mark had come to discuss. They took a seat on the worn wooden bench near the building's entrance, a spot they'd come to consider theirs during the months they'd spent talking here. The autumn sunlight cast a warm glow over the trees, and for a moment, they sat in companionable silence, watching leaves drift to the ground. "I got a letter from the town council," Mark began, his voice quiet. "They wanted to join a task force, community relations. It'd be about listening, working with people to make things better between the police and the town." Sam nodded slowly, his gaze thoughtful. "That's quite the responsibility," he replied, his tone encouraging but cautious. "I know," Mark said, running a hand over the back of his neck. "I'm honored, but I'm also worried. I've spent months trying to make up for my mistakes. But what if it's not enough? What if people still can't trust me?" Sam looked at him, his expression steady and kind. "You've made a lot of progress, Mark. You've put in the work, and people are starting to see that. But trust isn't something you can hurry, it's something you earn over time. And you can't focus on who doesn't trust you yet. You focus on showing up, doing the right thing, every single day." Mark nodded, feeling the words settle over him like a quiet reassurance. "So, you think I should accept?" Sam's smile widened, a glint of pride in his eyes. "I think you're exactly the kind of person this town needs for that role. You've been on both sides now. You know the weight of your mistakes, and that makes you someone who won't take this lightly." A swell of gratitude filled Mark's chest. "Thank you, Sam, for everything." Sam nodded, clapping a hand on Mark's shoulder. "Just remember," he said, his voice warm, "this journey of yours, it's only beginning." The first few weeks on the task force were challenging. Mark attended countless meetings, each one filled with voices, sharing experiences, suggestions, and at times frustrations. His role was simple yet demanding: to listen, to absorb, and to build actionable plans based on what the community needed and wanted. He helped design new programs, including cultural sensitivity training for officers and neighborhood meetings where residents could speak directly with law enforcement. At times, the meetings were tense, with residents voicing grievances that had festered for years. Mark knew these discussions were difficult, but he welcomed them, seeing in them the seeds of change. One evening, during a community event held in the park, Mark ran into Luis, the high school senior he had mentored. Luis was about to graduate and had recently been accepted into a community college with plans to study criminal justice. As they spoke, Luis looked at Mark with a mixture of admiration and something more a trust that had grown slowly but steadily over their months working together. "You know, I used to think all cops were the same," Luis admitted, his voice quiet but sincere. "But you've shown me that people can change. I didn't think that was possible before." Mark felt a swell of emotion at Luis's words. "I'm glad you gave me a chance, Luis," he replied, his voice thick. "I'm proud of the work you're doing, and I know you'll make a difference." Luis's gaze was steady, filled with determination. "That's the plan. I want to be the kind of cop who actually listens to people, who respects them, just like you're doing now." As Luis walked away, Mark felt a profound sense of pride, not just for Luis, but for the small role he had played in inspiring the young man's journey. Over the next several months, Mark's work with the task force expanded, and he became a familiar presence in neighborhoods where he'd once felt unwelcome. He regularly attended church events, school functions, and neighborhood gatherings, not as an officer on duty, but as a member of the community. At one point, the council implemented listening sessions, informal meetups where residents could talk openly about their concerns. One evening, during a session held at the local church, Mark sat among a circle of residents, listening as they shared their stories. An older woman, Mrs. Grant, recounted a memory of her son's difficult encounters with police, her voice thick with pain as she spoke. When she finished, Mark cleared his throat, feeling the weight of her words. "Mrs. Grant, I can't undo what happened to your son, and I won't pretend to know that pain. But I can promise you this. I'm here to listen, to learn, and to make sure no one else has to feel that way. I'll work every day to help build a relationship that's based on understanding, not fear." She looked at him for a long moment, and then, finally, she gave a small nod. "That's all we want, Officer Trenton. To be heard, to be respected." As the session ended, Mrs. Grant approached Mark, her expression thoughtful. "You know, it takes courage to do what you're doing," she said. "It's not easy to face what you've done and try to make it right. I respect that." Mark felt a swell of gratitude, her words a quiet validation of the months of effort he had poured into this journey. "Thank you," he replied, his voice soft. "That means more than you know." In early spring, the Veteran Center organized a ceremony to honor Sam and other veterans for their service and contributions to the community. It was a small but heartfelt event, held in the town square beneath the sprawling oaks that framed the park. Mark was invited as a guest speaker, a gesture he found both humbling and daunting. He spent hours preparing his words, wanting to do justice to Sam's legacy, to the lessons he had imparted. When the day arrived, he stood at the podium, looking out at a crowd filled with faces he had come to know, faces that had once held only distrust, but now reflected acceptance, even warmth. "Today, we honor those who have served with courage, those who have given of themselves for the sake of others," Mark began, his voice steady. "Sam Evans taught me that real courage doesn't always look like the movies. Sometimes it's quiet, humble, and patient. Sometimes it's a steady hand that guides others forward, a voice that speaks truth when it's hard to hear." He paused, looking towards Sam, who sat in the front row, his expression filled with quiet pride. "Sam showed me what it means to respect others, not by demanding authority, but by earning trust. He's taught me more than I could ever put into words, and for that, I'll be forever grateful." The crowd broke into applause, a wave of warmth and gratitude that washed over Mark. He felt a profound sense of peace, a knowledge that his life had been transformed not by a single act, but by a journey of listening, of changing, of making amends. As the ceremony ended, Mark and Sam shared a quiet moment together by the edge of the park. Sam looked at him, his gaze filled with a mixture of pride and fondness. "You've come a long way, Mark," Sam said, his voice low. "I knew you could do it. I knew you had it in you." Mark felt a lump in his throat, humbled by the words. "I owe it all to you, Sam. You gave me a chance when no one else would. Sam shook his head, a small smile on his face. You took that chance and made it yours. That was all you, son. They stood in silence, watching as families and friends lingered, sharing stories, laughter, and quiet moments of reflection. And in that silence, Mark knew he had found not just redemption, but a purpose rooted in service, in humility, and in the quiet, enduring work of earning trust. His journey was far from over, but with Sam's guidance and the support of the community, he felt ready to face whatever lay ahead, determined to live each day with honor, respect, and a commitment to making Ashton Heights a place of understanding and peace. Spring drifted into early summer, bringing longer days and warmer evenings to Ashton Heights. Mark found himself spending more time outdoors, reconnecting with parts of the town he had once overlooked. His role with the Community Relations Task Force had grown more intensive, but he welcomed the challenge. Each new project, each small victory, felt like a reaffirmation of the path he'd chosen. One Saturday morning, as part of a neighborhood cleanup day organized by the task force, Mark arrived at a small park on the south side of town. Volunteers of all ages were scattered across the park, raking leaves, painting fences, and clearing debris. Mark joined a group of kids who were planting flowers around the playground, his sleeves rolled up and his hands dirty as he dug holes for marigold and lavender plants. As he worked, a young girl named Lila, no more than 10, watched him with wide eyes. She tugged on his sleeve, her voice soft. "Are you a real police officer?" Mark smiled, looking down at her. "Yes, I am." Lila's eyes grew even wider, and she tilted her head thoughtfully. "But you're not scary like the other police. You're nice." The innocence in her words struck a chord with Mark. He realized that his journey toward change wasn't just for the people he had wronged. It was also for the next generation, the young ones who were still forming their ideas of trust, respect, and safety. "Well, thank you, Lila," he said gently. "I'm just trying to do my best, just like you." They continued planting, side by side, and Mark felt a quiet joy, a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with authority or duty, but everything to do with connection and understanding. In early July, the town held its annual Summer Street Fair, a beloved tradition in Ashton Heights where residents gathered to enjoy food, music, and games. Mark attended with Sam, who had volunteered to help run the fair's Veterans Appreciation Booth, a small space where residents could learn about local veterans and donate to support their services. As they manned the booth, Mark was approached by Mrs. Grant, the woman who had shared her family's painful experience with the police at one of the task force's listening sessions. She had a small plate of homemade cookies wrapped in a ribbon, and she offered them to him with a tentative smile. "Officer Trenton," she began, her tone softer than he'd remembered, "I wanted to thank you for the work you've been doing with the kids and with Sam here. My grandson was part of that mentorship program you helped start. It's made a real difference in his life." Mark took the plate, his heart warming. "Thank you, Mrs. Grant. I'm grateful for the chance to be a part of it." Mrs. Grant looked him over, as if seeing him anew. "It's good to see change, officer, and even better to see it lasting." She turned and walked away, leaving Mark with a sense of fulfillment that ran deeper than any formal commendation. Each interaction like this, he realized, was a small piece of the bridge he was building between himself and the community, a bridge he would continue to strengthen one moment at a time. As summer turned to autumn, Mark continued working with the mentorship program, becoming a trusted figure to many of the students. He developed a particular bond with Luis, who had begun his criminal justice studies at the local community college. Their regular meetups turned into informal mentoring sessions, with Mark helping Luis prepare for exams, navigate difficult coursework, and process the realities of a career in law enforcement. One evening, as they met at a small coffee shop near campus, Luis shared a personal story that left Mark moved. "You know," Luis began, his voice thoughtful, "there was a time when I hated the idea of working with cops. I thought they didn't care about people like me, people in my neighborhood." He paused, a look of determination on his face. "But you showed me something different, Officer Trenton. You showed me that maybe it's possible to do this work in a way that really helps people. I just wanted you to know that." Mark felt a lump in his throat, humbled by Luis's words. "Thank you, Luis. That means a lot. I'm proud of you. You're going to make a difference, I know it." Luis nodded, his eyes bright with gratitude. For the first time, Mark realized that his own journey had begun to inspire others, to open doors that had once felt closed. It was a small but powerful testament to the impact of a single, determined choice to change. In mid-October, Mark received an invitation to speak at the Ashton Heights Annual Civic Engagement Conference, a community event aimed at fostering dialogue between residents and leaders. The invitation caught him off guard. He was still adjusting to his evolving role, and the idea of speaking publicly about his journey felt daunting. But as he prepared his speech, he knew he wanted to be honest, to share his story not as a cautionary tale, but as a reminder of the power of humility and the potential for growth. On the day of the event, he stood at the podium, his heart racing as he looked out at the familiar faces gathered before him. "When I began this journey," he started, his voice steady but tinged with emotion, "I thought respect was something that could be demanded, something that came with authority. But I was wrong. I've come to learn that real respect is something you earn, and that it's a daily commitment to serving others with integrity, compassion, and openness." He paused, letting the words sink in. "I'm still learning. Every day I'm working to be better, to listen, and to understand. And I hope that, in time, I can continue to earn your trust, to serve this town in a way that brings us closer, not further apart." When he finished, the applause was quiet but heartfelt. A few people approached him afterward, sharing words of support, stories of their own growth, and encouragement to keep going. Mark felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that his journey had touched lives, that it had become a part of the larger story of Ashton Heights. As winter approached, Mark took on a new challenge, organizing a holiday charity event to benefit the Veterans Center and the mentorship program. The event, which included a food drive, toy collection, and community dinner, was a collaborative effort with local businesses, schools, and churches all contributing. On the night of the event, Mark looked around the crowded hall, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. Families gathered around tables. Children laughed as they opened donated gifts, and a sense of warmth and unity filled the room. The holiday lights glowed softly, casting a golden hue over the smiling faces, the hugs, and the quiet moments of gratitude shared by friends and neighbors. As the evening wound down, Sam approached him, a quiet smile on his face. "You've done well, Mark. This is what community looks like, what it feels like to be a part of something bigger than ourselves." Mark nodded, his heart full. "Thank you, Sam. I wouldn't be here without you." Sam shook his head, his eyes warm. "You're here because you chose to be, Mark. You did the hard work, and you've made this town better because of it." They shared a moment of quiet understanding, a bond forged not just by forgiveness, but by a shared commitment to building a brighter future. On a snowy January morning, as Mark walked through the streets of Ashton Heights, he reflected on the year that had passed. His journey had taken him from a place of shame and regret to one of hope and purpose, and though he knew the work was far from over, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known before. He stopped by the Veterans Center to meet with Sam, who had invited him to discuss plans for the upcoming year. As they sat together, mapping out ideas for community projects and programs, Mark felt a deep sense of gratitude. His life had been changed not by a single event, but by the countless small acts, the quiet moments of courage and humility, and the unwavering support of people like Sam. And as they talked, laughter filling the room, he realized that his journey wasn't just about redemption, it was about building a legacy of compassion, respect, and understanding that would continue long after he was gone. Years later, Ashton Heights had transformed into a town where community and law enforcement worked together in harmony. The programs Mark had helped establish flourished, becoming a model for neighboring towns. Luis went on to graduate and eventually returned to Ashton Heights as a young officer, embodying the values he had learned from Mark. Mark continued his work with the task force, becoming a mentor to new officers, guiding them with the same compassion and humility that had once been shown to him. And through it all, Sam remained by his side, a steady presence, a reminder of the journey they had taken together. In the end, Mark Trenton's legacy was not one of authority or power, but of quiet service, of respect earned through action, of lives changed by the willingness to listen, to learn, and to grow. His story became a part of Ashton Heights history, a testament to the power of redemption and the strength found in the courage to change. And as he looked back on the path he had taken, he knew, deep in his heart, that this was the life he was meant to lead, a life of purpose, of connection, and of endless possibility. Several years had passed since Mark's transformation began. Ashton Heights had changed too, growing into a town with a sense of unity and resilience that its residents now took pride in. At the annual community fair, Mark looked around, his heart swelling with gratitude for how far they had come. He noticed familiar faces scattered through the crowd. Young families gathered around games and food stalls, elderly couples holding hands as they strolled through the fairgrounds, teenagers volunteering at the event booths. A mix of faces, races, and generations filled the park, a reflection of the openness and diversity that Ashton Heights had learned to embrace. For the first time, Mark felt like he belonged here not as an authority figure, but as a true member of the community. As Mark moved through the crowd, he spotted Luis, now a full-fledged officer and one of the town's most promising young leaders. Luis had grown into his role with dedication, balancing empathy with the assertiveness needed to keep the peace. He waved when he saw Mark, making his way over with a grin. "Hey, Officer Trennan," Luis said, a hint of warmth and pride in his voice. "This is something, isn't it?" Mark nodded, watching the fair unfold around them. "It is. You've done a lot to make this possible, Luis." Luis shrugged, looking slightly embarrassed. "I had a good teacher. You taught me what it means to serve, to listen. Without that, I wouldn't be here." The words resonated deeply with Mark. He remembered when Luis had been a skeptical teenager, questioning every part of the system. Now, he was a part of it, reshaping it from the inside out. Mark clapped a hand on Luis's shoulder, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. "Keep it up, Luis. This town needs you." In the months that followed, Mark took on a new role as the town's community engagement officer, a position that focused on continuing to develop and maintain positive relationships between law enforcement and residents. The position allowed him to dedicate time to programs that educated officers on community-specific needs, from cultural competency workshops to specialized training on de-escalation. One afternoon, Mark held a meeting with new recruits, most of whom were young men and women just starting their careers. He shared his story with them, not as a lecture, but as a lesson on the importance of humility, respect, and continuous self-awareness. "I was where you were once," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "I thought wearing a badge made me an authority, someone people owed respect. But respect is something you earn through listening, through understanding. It's about making choices that serve, rather than control." One of the recruits, a young woman named Rachel, raised her hand. "How do you stay patient when people don't trust you? When it feels like they're judging you unfairly?" Mark thought for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "You stay patient because you know trust takes time. Each action, each conversation you have, it all adds up. It's not about proving yourself in a single moment. It's about showing up day after day in a way that makes people feel safe. And that trust, when it's earned, is worth every effort." The recruits listened with rapt attention, and Mark felt a renewed sense of purpose, knowing he was guiding them toward a future where they would serve with the integrity and respect that the community deserved. That winter, the town organized a ceremony to rename the community center in honor of Sam Evans, a celebration of his lifelong contributions to Ashton Heights. The dedication ceremony was held in the newly renovated center, the walls adorned with photos of Sam's life, from his days in the Navy to his years of service as a mentor and community leader. Mark was invited to give a speech, and as he stood before the crowd, he felt a mixture of sorrow and pride. "Today, we honor a man who embodied everything this town stands for," he began, his voice thick with emotion. Sam Evans was more than a mentor. He was a friend, a guide, and a pillar of strength. He taught me that respect isn't something you demand, but something you earn by how you treat others. His kindness, his patience, and his wisdom will live on in this center, in every life he touched. He paused, glancing around the room at the faces of those who had loved Sam. "It's up to us to carry forward his legacy, to live as he did with humility, with compassion, and with a commitment to lifting up everyone around us. Thank you, Sam, for everything. The applause was quiet but heartfelt, a tribute to a man whose impact could not be measured in words alone. Mark knew that Sam's legacy would live on in the community's actions, in the changes they'd made, and in the unity they had built. The next spring, the town council announced a new initiative inspired by the success of the Community Relations Task Force. Called Ashton Unity, the program was designed to foster open communication and transparency between residents and local officials, including law enforcement. Mark was chosen to lead the first round of workshops, which included sessions where residents could ask questions, address concerns, and collaborate on community projects. During one of these workshops, Mark met a young father named Jordan, who had recently moved to Ashton Heights with his wife and daughter. Jordan was reserved at first, his questions cautious, almost offensive. "You know," Jordan said one evening, "I've been to towns where these programs are just for show. They don't actually help people." Mark nodded, understanding the concern. "I get it, Jordan. I was part of a system that needed change, and it wasn't easy. But we're committed to real change here. Every person who speaks up, who takes part in this, helps us move forward. It's not just for show, it's our chance to make this place safe and welcoming for everyone." Jordan seemed to consider this, his expression softening. "I want that for my daughter. I want her to grow up in a place where she feels like she belongs." "We all want that," Mark replied, his voice steady. "And we're building it one step at a time." Over the following months, Jordan became a regular attendee at the workshops, volunteering his time and eventually becoming a core member of the program. Mark felt a quiet pride, knowing that the community he had once hurt was now the same community he was working to strengthen and heal. Years passed, and as Mark approached retirement, he found himself reflecting on the journey that had transformed his life. The community center, now a thriving hub of activity, was bustling with families, students, and volunteers. The mentorship program continued to grow, with former students like Luis now stepping in as mentors, guiding the next generation with the same care and dedication Mark had once shown them. One summer evening, Mark took a quiet walk through the town, feeling a sense of peace and fulfillment that came from knowing he had left a lasting impact. Ashton Heights had become more than a town to him. It was a testament to the power of growth, forgiveness, and community. As he reached the park where it had all begun, he noticed a young officer speaking to a group of kids near the playground. The officer's posture, his attentiveness, his quiet respect for each child's words reminded Mark of his own journey, of the lessons he had learned from Sam and the town he had once taken for granted. With a small smile, Mark continued his walk, knowing that his work had helped set a new standard for Ashton Heights, a legacy of kindness, humility, and respect. He understood now that true authority was not something you held, but something you shared, something you used to build others up. And as he walked away from the park, he knew that he was leaving behind not just a job, but a life's work, one that would continue to shape Ashton Heights for years to come. Thank you for joining me on this journey of transformation, forgiveness, and growth in Ashton Heights. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that dive deep into the heart of human experience. Every subscription helps me bring more inspiring, heartfelt narratives to life, and I'd love to have you along for the ride. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss a single chapter of the journeys we explore together. Thank you, and stay tuned for more.